Constantine. Here we go.
I got it.
Okay.
Thanks, Greg.
Nice job.
Where it's going to record to, I can't tell you.
We'll figure that out. So anyway, Christianity is under the reign of Constantine. Constantine's gathered bishops in several gathering places, one of which is Nicaea, tells them that, you know, to quit fighting about the nature of Jesus, whether Jesus is all God, half God, part God. Constantine doesn't care. Constantine tells them, you guys figure this out, agree on it, decide what's orthodox and what's not, and then make sure that however this comes out, I'm the main act on earth. So that would fit perfectly for him. And that's what he got. And so the bishops met. We get, among other things, the Nicene Creed. Anyway, most Christians said, I'm glad that persecution is over. But others said, why should we accept Christianity as it comes to us now with the stamp of the emperor on it? The empire killed our founder, and until last month, it was killing us. And so that made a difference. I was out at the Trappist Monastery some years ago and asked Brother Philip there, how he saw the desert movement beginning. And he said, well, you need to remember the line from Jesus that says, blessed are you when people persecute you for my sake in the Gospels. That left those Christians who were circumspect with the thought, with martyrdom over, how do you give your all for Jesus? How do you get that blessing that he talked about there? Blessed are those who are persecuted for my sake in the Gospels. What happens when we no longer have the ultimate means of blessing? Can we find a new way to give our all for Christ? That was just imprinted on these people, and this is what they did. They went out into the deserts of Egypt and Syria and Palestine. So the first one that was certainly the George Washington of the desert movement was Anthony the Great. Let me just tell you a few things about him. We have actually an autobiography, or excuse me, a biography of him. He was illiterate, so he couldn't write his own biography. But Athanasius, an early church father, wrote it, and it had a huge effect on the world. Anthony was born very aristocratic, was son of property owners who died in his teen years. One Sunday, he was meditating on his possessions on his way to church. And then when he got to church, the text that was read was on the story of the rich young ruler, where it says, you lack one thing, go sell everything and give it to the poor and come and follow me. And Anthony responded to that sermon by selling most of what he had, saving some back for himself and for his younger sister, who he was the guardian of. And then sometime after that, he went to church again and heard the text read about the lilies of the field. And take no thought for tomorrow. So he sold the rest and put his sister in a home for Christian virgins and went outside of the town he lived in Egypt, and began living in an empty tomb. He still attended church. I said he was illiterate, but he was able to memorize just about any scripture he heard. And his extreme lifestyle, and the fact that, he had kind of an economic whiplash, having everything and giving it all away, attracted disciples. But he didn't like that at all to begin with. And so, seeking further solitude, he went further into the desert to an abandoned fort. And Athanasius' story tells us that he stayed there mostly by himself for 20 years with disciples who would bring him a large bin of bread twice a year. Somehow he got along. Eventually, they wouldn't let him be alone anymore. They demanded to be instructed by him. He did that. He grew famous. He died in the year 356 AD at the age, Athanasius tells us, of 105. At which point he asked two of his, well, before that, he asked two of his disciples to bury his body, leaving no trace of him, which should tell you something about him. Anyway, as I said, the biography of Anthony appeared and immediately after his death, in fact, and it flooded the desert with hermits. The Greek word eremos means desert, so that's where the word hermit comes from. Saint Augustine, eventually a lecturer in rhetoric at Milan, gave up plans to marry after reading the biography, and that put him on a trajectory that led him to become the Bishop of Hippo. Anyway, Athanasius noted that Anthony's manners were not rough, but gracious and refined. He was well-spoken. Neither in height nor breadth was he conspicuous above others, but in the serenity of his manner and the purity of his soul. So he's the beginner of this flight to the desert. At the time, pagans, Romans saw Christianity as, quote, a religion for widows and morons. That's pretty much how it was written up. And their criticism actually helped the literate Christians to correct their faulty arguments for their faith. And the intellectual side of Christianity was born with, its own implications. But Anthony's side of Christianity rejected not only the empire, but all the bishops and all of the creeds that came from the bishops, because he saw it all coming from the same place. Again, these were the people that killed their spiritual master. Some people tried, in fact, to involve Anthony in the early Trinitarian controversy, the discussion I was talking about the makeup of Jesus. And he saw that as a theological black hole and would have nothing to do with it. Monastics like Anthony felt that the simplicity of Jesus was actually being undermined by everything the empire was doing in consort with the bishops, and that the essential mystery of Jesus was being undercut. I had a professor in seminary named Kusuki Koyama who brought a definite Asian and Japanese bend to his Christian theological teaching. While he was at the seminary, he wrote a small book called No Handle on the Cross. And he said, Westerners have to have a handle on everything. And he drew a little picture of a briefcase, with a really nice handle on it. And he said, we have to feel like we understand the essence of everything. And so, as a matter of fact, what ends up happening is that we create or adopt false notions about those things that are meant to be left as mysteries. A later Christian teacher, German, Meister Eckhart said, quote, "He who speaks of the Trinity lies." Less dramatic is just the Eastern saying that says that the intellect is a good servant, but a poor master. Okay, so today we have a reaction against the Enlightenment, the time when science and learning made great leaps. And that reaction comes actually from the right and the left. For conservatives, they don't like we know it's in the news all the time. They don't like evolution. They don't like vaccinations. I mean, there's a lot of things, right? Uh, Progressives, though, don't like the fact that advances of enlightenment have led people to believe that science is eventually going to answer all questions and obliterate all mysteries. That's the other side of this. So, there is the tendency, getting back to the subject at hand of the desert mothers and fathers, to write them all off as religious fanatics. Um, I do want to say that here's a book called The Lives of the Desert Fathers by Benedicta Ward. And then there's also a book called The Forgotten Desert Mothers. So you get an idea that there's a lot of that going on, as there should be. Um, the most common misconception about the desert fathers and mothers is that they were merely renunciates. If you know anything about Eastern religion, particularly, you know about the tendency of monks and nuns to renounce the world. Um, there's a bit of drama to that, but there doesn't have to be. And that's kind of what I want to talk about here as these men and women who went out to the desert sorted out things, uh, realizing that the ego is a bit deceitful in us. And well, you'll get it as I tell this story. Many of the early brothers who went out and lived in these little huts, these little cells that were on the landscape, had an eccentric horror of having possessions of any kind. Well, they had to live, right? They still had to live. So, um, what they did out there, these mothers and fathers, was live independently because they saw that the best spiritual director of all was the Holy Spirit, and that being alone was the place to get right with your own soul. It was a little like people who go on 30-day silent retreats, right? It's the same principle. Anyway, these people lived, just very briefly, in single huts, usually within sight of other huts from other people in their community. They're out in the desert. They're not on land that people want to own. They are in sight of one another so they can sort of keep track of each other. And they get together once a week for church and maybe even communion. Um, that's how they live. They live on very simple diet of bread for the most part. Um, and they make baskets, as you might imagine, that are sold at the Saturday farmers market. Um, they also make fishnets and other things that people find useful that they can make out of anything, what they can find in the river valleys of Egypt. Um, so here's an example of a teaching that's been saved from this time. A desert monk met with his Abba, his spiritual father, and says, Abba, I gave away everything I own and I've adopted life in my single cell. But one day I noticed a flower growing up inside it and began to bloom. So I ripped it out. And the spiritual master said, well, that might be fine. Except I'd say to any monk who did such a thing that if he found after doing that he couldn't live without the flower, he should plant it again. I think that exchange between the Abba and the monk is very much in keeping with the kind of teaching uh, that was going on, and the fact that they were trying to rein in their ego impulses, which were, always extreme. Um, we're talking again about renunciation, and a teacher from our time, who's no longer living, but who was very wise, a man named Anthony de Mello, said, Anytime you renounce something, you are tied forever to the thing you renounce. Don't renounce it. See through it. Understand its true value, and you won't need to renounce it. So those who went out into the desert and stayed were able to stay, found that it was a place of renewal for them, were not those who just renounced the world. They were those who saw through it. Let me see if I can unpack that a little better. Ram Dass, another kind of saint from our time, talks about this. He uses the term the horny celibate syndrome. What's the horny celibate syndrome? He says it's where you're busy not doing what you've renounced. Okay, you're just so intent on not doing it. Like the person who says, I've stopped smoking. I haven't had a cigarette in 3 months, 4 days, 6 hours, and 55 minutes. Okay, you got it? Think of people who get divorced and change their habits in a big way. Often it's legitimate, the person they partnered with kept them from being who they really were. But sometimes they do something, often kind of weird as a way of continuing to play their life to their ex. This thing can take all kinds of forms of manifestation. St. Augustine didn't just become celibate, he renounced sexuality. And that renouncement of sexuality is shot through his confessions and his doctrine of original sin. And, we've suffered ever since. So let me tell you a story from the desert that you might not even believe, but it's fascinating. It comes out of a book called The Harlots of the Desert, an unfortunate title, but there it is. Anyway, this is a reflection on a lot of the ethos of the desert. I'm going to read right here. This is from the life of the woman Pelagia, who eventually became a desert dweller herself. Anyway, but it doesn't begin with her. It begins with this. The most holy bishop of the city of Antioch called together all the bishops nearby about a certain matter. And so 8 bishops came, and among them was Nonus, that's Nonnus, the most holy man of God. My bishop, a marvelous man and a most observant monk of the monastery called Tamanisis. Anyway, the story goes this way. When we were seated, the bishops asked my lord Nonus to speak to them. And at once the holy bishop began to speak words for the edification and salvation of all. Now, while we were marveling at his holy teaching, lo, suddenly there came among us the chief actress of Antioch, the first in the chorus of the theater. This is Pelagia, sitting on a donkey. She was dressed in the height of fantasy, wearing nothing but gold, pearls, and precious stones. Even her bare feet were covered with gold and pearls. With her went a great throng of boys and girls, all dressed in cloth of gold, with collars of gold on their necks, going before and following her. So great was her beauty that all the ages of mankind could never come to the end of it. So they passed through our company, filling all the air with traces of music and the most sweet smell of perfume. When the bishop saw her bareheaded and with all her limbs shamelessly exposed with such lavish display, there was not one who did not hide his face in his veil or his scapular, averting their eyes as if from a very great sin. But the most holy Nonus gazed after her very intently for a long time. And after she had gone by, he turned round and still gazed after her. Then he turned toward the bishops sitting round him and said, "Were you not delighted by her great beauty?" When they did not reply, he buried his face in his knees over the Holy Bible, which he held in his hands, and all his emotion came out in tears. Sighing deeply, he said again to the bishops, "Were you not delighted by her great beauty?" Still they did not answer. So, indeed, he said, I was very greatly delighted, and her beauty pleased me very much. See, he said, God will place her before his awful and tremendous judgment seat, and he will judge her on her gifts, just as he will judge us on our episcopal calling. And he went out on to say to the bishops, what do you think, beloved brothers? How many hours does this woman spend in her chamber, giving all her mind and attention to adorning herself for the play, in order to lack nothing in beauty and adornment of the body? She wants to please all those who see her, lest those who are her lovers today find her ugly and do not come back tomorrow. And here are we, who have an almighty God in heaven offering us heavenly gifts and rewards, our immortal bridegroom who promises good things to us, his watchmen, things that cannot be valued, which eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor has it entered into the heart of human beings to know what things God has prepared for those who love him. What else can I say? When we have such promises, when we are going to see the great and glorious face of our bridegroom, which has a beauty beyond compare, upon which the cherubim do not dare to gaze, why do we not adorn ourselves and wash the dirt from our unhappy souls? Why do we let ourselves lie so neglected? When he had said all this, Bishop Nonus took me, his sinful deacon, with him, and we went to the rooms we had been given for our lodging. And going into his bedchamber, the bishop threw himself on the ground with his face to the floor, and beating his breast, he wept, saying, Lord Jesus Christ, I know I am a sinner and unworthy, for today the ornaments of a harlot have shone more brightly than the ornaments of my soul. How can I turn my face toward you? What words can justify me in your sight? I will not hide my heart from you, for you know all its secrets. There's always that back and forth in the desert tradition uh, between what people think is holy and expected of holy people and those like Nonus who blow it all up. Uh, as will happen naturally in life as you come upon things or things come upon you, like a parade of actresses from Antioch. Um, the same sort of thing happens with the subject of fast. Early on, it was assumed that fasting was good. You know, we find it in the Gospels. Jesus fasted. Um, it was thought then that, you know, a little fasting's good, a lot of fasting must be even better. Except people began to realize quite soon that the practice had to be curtailed because it began to smack too much of dramatic renunciation. And so eventually the emphasis became more about, you know, simple self-control. Don't let the passions control you. Here's one of the teachings from the desert about that. Abba Pambo, one of the fathers, asked Abba Anthony, what ought I to do? And the old man said to him, do not trust in your own righteousness. Do not worry about sins of the past, but control your tongue and your stomach. So the idea of, you know, just self-control became the most important thing. And one meal a day, eating just one meal a day became fairly standard. Again, there's always the temptation to, because of this, to, you know, have radical ideas about food. There's a story that comes down from the desert, said a disciple saw a few peas lying on the ground one day and asked his master, should I pick them up? And his master said, why? Did you put them there? There's a lot of that in the desert tradition. Well, Thomas Merton, who we will look at last in the 6-week journey we're on here, had this to say about the whole business. Let's see if I've got this right. Number 3. Yeah, there it is. A brother asked one of the elders, what good thing shall I do and have life thereby? And the old man replied, God alone knows what's good. However, I've heard it said that someone inquired of Father Abbot Nesterios the Great, the friend of Abbot Anthony, asking, "What good work shall I do?" And he replied, "Not all works are alike, for Scripture says that Abraham was hospitable and God was with him. And Elias loved solitary prayer, and God was with him. And David was humble, and God was with him. Therefore, whatever you see your soul to desire according to God, do that thing, and you shall keep your heart safe." I think that last bit, keep your heart safe, is really what this is all about. Of course, they had ideas about devils and things like that, being under attack and spiritual warfare and all of that. But they were always understanding that the heart is a fragile thing, and the ego is something that can be out of control. And they were always dealing with that. Okay. They also, living in the desert, were highly focused on the text, as a matter of fact, that we had this morning about Jesus in the wilderness, facing temptations. And they understood that passage, particularly as it comes from Matthew and Luke, they had a really interesting understanding of it. They saw the essential temptations that Jesus was under were to be relevant, spectacular, and powerful. Remember, bread, feed us, and you'll be relevant, and that's all we'll need. Or to jump from the pinnacle, and be spectacular, or to acquire power and rule and dominate the world. The desert Christians realized they had to be the opposite of each of those. So they were trying to choose, and talked a lot about being irrelevant, and transparent, unassuming, that is, and instead of powerful, weak or ordinary. And to refer us back to Constantine, anything he did bothered a certain among them. You might remember that on the night before a great battle, just north of Rome in the year 312, Constantine had a dream in which he saw the sign of the cross and the words in the sky, "By this sign you will conquer." Well, these desert Christians knew that story. Everybody knew that story. And it outraged them to see the cross, which for them was a sign of suffering, transformed into a sign of power. They just knew it didn't fit with what they knew about Jesus from the teachings in the Gospels. So Anthony tried to be as irrelevant as possible. And when he received a letter from Emperor Constantine, because Constantine had his finger on the pulse of what was going on, and knew that Anthony was highly revered by many, and that there was this movement going on in the deserts of Egypt, Anthony received this letter, but wouldn't read it, nor would he have it read to him, nor did he tear it up, which is interesting. He just renounced temporal power completely, and that was his way of dealing with it. Let me go on. Transparency, being unassuming, being non-spectacular. You might not be surprised to know that there was people vying for attention in the desert, that some sought to be spectacularly ascetic. And there was a particular kind of war going on between the monks of Egypt and those of Syria. The ones in Syria were led by the pillar monks. That's where monks would get up on pillars and would say, well, Jesus wants us to do these kinds of things because he said, you're the light of the world. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under a bushel basket. You put it on top of everything. So these guys, particularly Simon, it was called Simon the Stylites, meaning pillar hermit, was the most famous, and put himself up on a pillar that was 6 feet tall, and then he moved it 9 feet tall, and eventually it grew to, as some say, the estimate was about 60 feet. Um, and he stayed up there for like 36 years and drew a lot of attention to himself. Um, and the hermits from Egypt thought that pretty ridiculous. Um, in fact, they mistrusted uh, anything that would lead to a person being well known. Um, they heard from a particular monk named Evagrius, who was well educated, who came to a little town where they had a lot of monks named the town was called Scetis. He gave his lecture. And afterward, one of the monks commented, "We know, Father, that if you'd stayed in Alexandria, you would have been made a bishop." Um, and this was a slam against Evagrius, but he didn't know it. He thought it was a compliment. Another story from the desert about a fellow named John the Dwarf. One day, he announced to his fellow monks that he was going off in the desert to live as an angel. He thought somehow he would be spared the need for food. Uh, a few days later, as you might imagine, he came back extremely hungry and knocked on the cell door of another monk, saying it was John. Uh, and the monk said, John is now an angel and no longer has need of food or shelter. Um, that's how they dealt with it. Let me read a little bit from Benedict Award, who's probably best known, the best known writer about this tradition. The desert was not a gigantic gymnasium where athletes vied with one another in endurance tests. When one of the fathers went in disguise to a monastery during Lent, he outdid all the monks in asceticism. His name was Macarius the Egyptian, and he was very tough. At the end of a week, the Abba led him outside and said, "You have taught us all a lesson, Father, but now please, would you mind going away, lest my sons become discouraged and despair? We have been edified by you enough." The monks, she writes, the monks went without sleep because they were watching for God. They did not speak because they were listening to God. They fasted because they were fed by the word of God. It was the end that mattered. The ascetic practices were only a means to that end. The cell was of central importance in their asceticism. Sit in your cell and it will teach you everything, they said. The point was that unless a human being could find God here in this one place, his cell, he would not find him by going somewhere else. But they had no illusions about what it meant to stay in the cell. It meant to stay there in mind as well as body. To stay there in body, but to think about the outside world was already to have left it. So I think that explains really clearly what's going on here. Again, life in the cell was the same as going on a silent retreat that was in, you know, uh, a long silent retreat. The best spiritual director, again, being the Holy Spirit, except that they understood that they needed direction, and that's why they had the Abbas. Let me read Thomas Merton's understanding of this whole business. These monks insisted on remaining human and ordinary. This may seem to be a paradox, but it's very important. If we reflect a moment, we will see that to fly into the desert in order to be extraordinary is only to carry the world with you as an implicit standard of comparison. The result would be nothing but self-contemplation and self-comparison with the negative standard of the world one had abandoned. Some of the monks of the desert did this, as a matter of fact, and the only fruit of their trouble was that they went out of their heads. The simple men who lived their lives out to a good old age among the rocks and sands only did so because they had come into the desert to be themselves, their ordinary selves, and to forget a world that divided them from themselves. There can be no other valid reason for seeking solitude or for leaving the world. And thus to leave the world is, in fact, to help save it in saving oneself. This is the final point, and it is an important one. The hermits who left the world as though escaping from a wreck did not merely intend to save themselves. They knew that they were helpless to do any good for others as long as they floundered about in the wreckage. But once they got a foothold on solid ground, things were different. Then they had not only the power, but even the obligation to pull the whole world to safety after them. Merton, I think, understood them as well as anybody. Let me read a little more from Benedict Ward on the same subject. The essence of the spirituality of the desert, that it was not taught but caught. It was a whole way of life. It was not an esoteric doctrine or a predetermined plan of ascetic practice that would be learned and applied. The Father or Abba was not the equivalent of a Zen Buddhist master. It is important to understand this because there really is no way of talking about the way of prayer or the spiritual teaching of the Desert Fathers. They did not have a systematic way. They had the hard work and experience of a lifetime of striving to redirect every aspect of body, mind, and soul to God. And that is what they talked about. That also is what they meant by prayer. Prayer was not an activity undertaken for a few hours every day. It was a life continually turned toward God. Abba Joseph came to Abba Lot and said to him, Father, according to my strength, I keep a moderate rule of prayer and fasting, quiet and meditation, and as far as I can, I control my imagination. What more must I do? And the old man rose and held his hands toward the sky, so that his fingers became like flames of fire. And he said, if you will, you can become all flame. What is the difference between wisdom and being enlightened? Between wisdom and being enlightened. It's the difference between carrying a torch and becoming one. I didn't make that up. I found it somewhere. So a little more from just a little more from the tradition. A monk was so tormented by temptation that he could bear it no longer. So he decided to abandon his cell and go somewhere else. And as he was putting on his sandals to carry out his resolve, he saw another monk not far away, also putting on his sandals. Who are you? He asked the stranger. I am yourself, was the reply. And if it's on my account that you're leaving this place, I'll have you know that wherever you go, I will go with you. That's, quintessential story about the cell. If you can't find God in your cell, you won't find God anywhere else. Some years ago, Joan Chittister, who's a wonderful Benedictine nun, wrote a new rule of St. Benedict. And you get in her rewriting of the rule of Benedict, which is the rule of all monks that goes way, way back. You get a sense of this kind of back and forth about ego from the desert tradition. She says, the rule does not call for absolute silence. It calls instead for thoughtful talk. The rule does not call for self-abasement, but for humility, which she defines as, quote, a proper sense of self in a universe of wonders. The monastery is not an escape from the problems of the world. Rather, it provides an opportunity to confront life in all its complexity and richness. As Thomas Merton said, the monk abandons the world only in order to listen more intently to the deep and most neglected voices that proceed from its depths, spiritual depths. So I'll just close with this. The first rule of life these people discovered was not asceticism for asceticism's sake, but instead it was love. A visitor was said to have been welcomed by a monk who had already eaten his day's meal, the one meal. The hermit, though, prepared another meal and sat down with his visitor to eat with him. And the visitor said, "Forgive me for making you break your rule, Father." And the fellow said, "My rule is to receive you with hospitality and to send you away in peace." Finally, let me tell you one more story that's quite famous from this tradition about how love takes precedence over being judgmental. This is about a famous monk whose name was Moses. A brother in Scetis, again, that's the town where they were all gathered. A brother at Scetis committed a fault. A council was called to which Abba Moses was invited, but he refused to go to it. Then the priest sent someone to say to him, "Come, everyone is waiting for you." So he got up and went, and he took a leaking jug, filled it with water, and carried it with him. The others came out to meet him and said to him, "What is this, Father?" And the old man said to them, "My sins run out behind me, and I do not see them. And today I'm coming to judge the errors of another." And when they heard that, they said no more to the brother, but forgave him. Right. Well, we have a little time left. Did some of that interest you? Please feel free
Scott,
to
when
jump
did
in.
the oh,
Go ahead.
when did the
Oh, this is from Kent. Okay.
when did the period of the desert hermits end? You kind of let us know when it started, and how long did it go on?
Hundreds of years, and it went from again single cells where monks lived alone to actual cities of monks in the desert where hundreds and hundreds of people gathered. It became, so it went from the simplicity of the single cell to these massive places that were ruled, which called for the rule of Benedict eventually to help them organize. Interestingly, I guess it never really ended because those larger ones gave birth to other ones in other places around the globe, of course. And it was Thomas Merton himself who, when he went to the monastery called Gethsemane outside of Louisville, Kentucky, um, was studying the desert tradition and said to his abbot, "Why should we live in dormitories where we have absolutely no privacy?" The original monks had cells that were individual, and their cells taught them everything. And so that abbot understood that, and the idea of the single cell came back and is still part of the Trappist tradition right now, which is kind of interesting. But it took what, nearly 2,000 years for that to come round.
In the last story, tell me again what the man said. He carried a leaking jug,
Right.
water ran out.
He said, they said to him, what's going on? Because, they saw his water going down his robe behind him. And he said, my sins run out behind me, and I do not see them. And today I am coming to judge the errors of another. Um, so he realized how hypocritical they all were in judging one of their own. Thanks for the asking clarification. It was a little subtle.
So, Scott, I'm speaking from ignorance, but I've heard that this tradition continued on and into the centuries where Islam spread and Sufism rose as sort of the mystical um, branch of Islam, and that there was some overlap and interplay between Christian mysticism and Muslim mysticism
Yeah.
once you get a few more centuries down the road.
I'm unschooled in that, but it makes perfect sense. And you look at the teachings of Rumi, the poems of Rumi, and they sound somewhat similar, though Rumi is a spiritual teacher with few peers, if any. I just love that again that we've got empire doing its thing and taking over religion as best it can. Uh, and the bishops, they get in bed with the emperor. And then there are those who those who think that's wonderful and who think, anything about Jesus should be connected to power. And then there are those who look at the gospel story and the simplicity of the peasant Jesus, and they say, we're not going there. We're not going there. That cannot be of God. You know, Putin's greatest ally is the head of the Orthodox Church in Russia right now.
But you know what we were taught in theology didn't come from the desert fathers, right? It came from those guys that were in the organized religion.
You bet. Yep.
And guys, I might say.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
What are you saying to it? Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's peeling it back is fascinating, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, Scott, Paul said that pray without ceasing, I think, and my one earlier thoughts were that the hermits were out there praying without ceasing, and you kind of mentioned that that was what was thought, but they were really much more than that. And do you think they had Paul's letters, and kind of where did that go? Because that was certainly pre acceptance from Rome and domination by Rome when Paul was writing.
Oh, letters. Here's what I know about their prayer life. Again, most of these people were illiterate, but their powers for memorization were tremendous, as ours would be if we were illiterate. And so they memorized, and this was, if not universal, close to it. They have memorized all 150 Psalms in order, and as best they could, obviously. And they would repeat them all day long from memory while they're weaving these baskets and other things, right? So it's they're busy all the time. And those psalms would go on in their hearts and in their heads, even when they weren't even, thinking. It just became like breathing for them. So that was the earliest form in the Christian monastic tradition that I know of praying without ceasing. As soon as they finished number 150, they went back to number 100. And some of them said they found themselves doing it through, they'd wake up at night and they'd still be doing it in their dream life.
But that's one interpretation of what that means, praying without ceasing.
Sure.
There's other interpretations, which is just be grateful, enjoy the beauty, think about people that you care about. There's other ways to think about that phrase.
Yeah. I like that saying somewhere in the little talk there about how Abba Anthony said, David had his way, which was humility. Moses had his way. Everyone should find their own way of being spiritual.
I wonder about
Sounds so advanced to me, Go ahead.
I wonder about the role of physical activity and work, because in a lot of the more later wisdom and spiritual traditions, there's an emphasis on
Right, work
the
part
body and the spirit and everything, and that work is prayer, and physical activity is an important part of spiritual discipline. I didn't hear you mention any of that as in relation to the Desert Fathers.
Right, because at first they were mostly working on in their own cells individually. Again, making fish nets, nets for hunters, baskets, and also the ones who didn't have the ability to make baskets made mats. And when they sold these, people knew they were being sold to Christians out in the desert, and partly anyway, yeah. I think it was probably when they began sharing work in large monasteries that tradition you're talking about became part of their life.
Scott, I thought it was interesting when you were talking about renunciation and how when we do that, we tend to fixate too much on what we gave up and focus on that. And you compared that to see it through. Could you talk a little bit more about that? The first part I totally get, resonated for sure. But what exactly do you mean by see it through?
Did I say see it through?
I thought that's what I understood. What did you say? Instead of renunciation, we need to
See
through it. I think it was.
work
See
through it.
through it.
Yeah, see through it, I think you said.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's what it was. It was see through, right. See, yeah. I'm not doing a good job of explaining it, but I do remember that you don't renounce it, you see through it. You don't renounce the empire, you see through its wiles and what it's actually doing and call it for what it is. That kind of thing.
That's one of the things that really resonated with me and what you were talking about. Years and years ago, I studied with a spiritual community called Eureka, and they wanted us to basically separate from what we were doing in our regular life. And for the life of me, I could not see how I could do, A, I didn't see how I could do it, but B, even if I, quit working and joined their community, I didn't see how that was going to be the answer.
Mhm.
And I wanted them to tell me how it is you live in the world with their teaching, which was very valuable. but it didn't cover how you handled the daily stuff all day long.
Mhm.
And so, you know, the idea of seeing through it, of understanding, okay, this is this world. This is the other thing.
Yeah.
That's very meaningful.
That's helpful. Well, we're already over our hour, and we said that we'd release people to go their own way. Next week, we're going to look at Julian of Norwich, who's a 14th century British person who asked after a near-death experience around the age of 30 to be walled up in a little cell just off the side of a church in Norwich, England, where she became an Abba or an Abbas, I guess, a spiritual director for the whole city. It's an amazing story. Someone who's just becoming more and more popular now, partly because she was so far ahead of her time. She even spoke of God as a woman, and she's just a fascinating person to study, and we know enough about her life to be able to tell some of her story. She's kind of like Jesus. She doesn't come on the scene until she's 30, and we have to speculate a little bit about what might have happened earlier. But it's a great story, so I hope you'll join us next week. Week after that, Eileen jumps in with St. Francis and Clare. The week after that, we look at the Dark Night of the Soul through Mark Lesniewski, who's a wonderful member of the Franciscan Spiritual Center. Then we do Thérèse of Lisieux, a French saint who talks about her little way of being spiritual. And finally, Thomas Merton, who was referred to a number of times here. So God bless everyone.
Thank
Happy
you.
Lent.
Good night.
On for the ride. This was great.
Good night.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.
Getting in your bed.